Red Bull just had a nightmare in China. 0 points. Engine failure. A frustrated Verstappen calling the car almost undrivable. That's what everyone saw. But here's what nobody expected. That failure may have given them the exact answer they needed. Because while Mercedes is dominating with 2-1-2 finishes in the first 2 races, Red Bull may have just discovered what's really behind that advantage. And more importantly, how to break it. We're talking about the one weakness inside this new generation of engines. The one detail that controls everything. Power, energy, consistency. And if Red Bull is right, this changes the entire championship. Because this isn't about catching Mercedes slowly. This is about unlocking something overnight. A breakthrough that could turn the fastest team into the most vulnerable one. Subscribe now, because if Red Bull has truly figured this out, what happened in China wasn't a failure. It was the beginning of a comeback that could destroy Mercedes' dominance. From the outside, China looked like a disaster for Red Bull. But inside the garage, it was something very different. Because while Verstappen was dealing with traffic, instability, and a car that didn't respond, engineers were watching something else. Not the result. Not the position. The behavior. Because from the very first laps, something felt off. The car wasn't just slow. It was inconsistent. Unpredictable on throttle. Struggling to deliver power cleanly out of corners. And that's critical in this new era. Because in 2026, power isn't just about speed. It's about how smoothly you can deliver it. How controlled that energy feels when the driver pushes. And Verstappen felt it immediately. The rear wasn't stable. The power wasn't linear. Every acceleration phase required correction. And that forces one thing. Compromise. You can't attack. You can't push to the limit. You're constantly adjusting. Managing. Surviving. And while that was happening, Mercedes was doing the exact opposite. Clean exits. Stable delivery. No hesitation. No corrections. Just pure, controlled acceleration. And that contrast is what triggered the first real alarm inside Red Bull. Because when 2 cars behave that differently under the same rules, the difference is never small. It's fundamental. But here's where things start to get interesting. Because as the race progressed, Red Bull began to notice something even more specific. The problem wasn't just at peak power. It was in the transition. The moment between harvesting energy and deploying it again. That tiny window. Almost invisible to fans. But everything to engineers. Because if that transition isn't perfect, you lose time. You lose stability. And most importantly, you lose confidence. And that's exactly what Verstappen was feeling. Every time he went back on throttle, there was hesitation. A slight delay. A mismatch between what he expected and what the car delivered. And in Formula 1, that fraction of a second is the difference between control and chaos. Now compare that to Mercedes. No hesitation. No delay. Energy flows in and comes straight back out. Smooth. Continuous. Predictable. And that's when Red Bull realized something critical. This isn't about how much energy you have. It's about how you manage the flow of it. And more importantly, how stable that flow is under pressure. Because as temperatures rise, as components heat up, most systems become less efficient, less predictable. But Mercedes doesn't. They stay stable. And that suggests something very specific. They're operating inside a thermal window that others can't maintain. And that's where everything starts to connect. Because Red Bull's issue in China wasn't just a failure. It was a symptom. A sign that they were pushing outside that window. Too aggressive. Too unstable. Too close to the edge. And eventually, the system broke. But here's the key moment. Because when engineers reviewed that failure, they didn't just see what went wrong. They saw where it went wrong. The exact conditions. The exact limits. The exact point where performance turns into risk. And that's something you can work with. Because once you identify the limit, you can start redefining it. You can adjust how the system behaves before reaching that point. You can smooth the transitions. Stabilize the delivery. Control the temperature. And suddenly, you're no longer chasing raw power. You're building control. The same control Mercedes already has. And that realization is where everything begins to change. And this is where Red Bull's mindset completely changes. Because once you understand that the problem isn't power, you stop chasing more of it. You start chasing stability, control, precision. And that's a very different direction. Because until China, Red Bull was trying to extract performance by pushing harder. More aggressive deployment. More energy release. More demand on the system. But now they know that approach doesn't work in this era. Because the limit isn't defined by peak power anymore. It's defined by how long you can hold it, and how cleanly you can deliver it. That's what Mercedes has mastered. Not the peak, the duration, the consistency. And Red Bull finally sees it. Which means their development path changes immediately. Not small tweaks. Not minor adjustments. A shift in philosophy. Because now the goal is clear. Create an engine that behaves predictably under pressure. One that doesn't spike, doesn't hesitate, doesn't collapse when temperatures rise. And to do that, they're focusing on something very specific. The interaction between combustion and electrical systems. Because in this new generation, those two elements are no longer separate. They're deeply connected. If combustion is unstable, energy recovery suffers. If recovery is inconsistent, deployment becomes unpredictable. And suddenly, the entire system falls apart. That's exactly what happened in China. But here's where it gets dangerous for Mercedes. Because Red Bull believes they've identified the missing link. Not just where they failed, but why Mercedes doesn't. A more controlled combustion cycle. Cleaner. More stable. Which leads to better thermal management. Which leads to more efficient energy flow. And that creates the exact effect we've been seeing. Sustained deployment. No drop-off. No instability. What looks like an endless push is actually perfect balance. And if Red Bull can replicate that balance, everything changes overnight. Because they already have one thing Mercedes can't replicate. Verstappen. A driver who can extract performance the moment the car gives him confidence. The moment the rear becomes predictable. The moment the power delivery becomes clean. He doesn't need time. He doesn't need adaptation. He attacks. Immediately. And that's what makes this so critical. Because right now, Mercedes' biggest advantage is that no one else can operate at their level of control. But if Red Bull reaches that level, even briefly, that advantage disappears. And the fight becomes something else entirely. Because then it's no longer about who understands the system better. It's about who executes better on track. And in that scenario, everything becomes unpredictable. But there's one more layer to this. Because solving the technical problem is only part of the battle. The real challenge is how fast they can implement it. Because Formula One doesn't wait. Every race matters. Every weekend builds momentum. Mercedes is already accumulating results, confidence, data, and Red Bull is playing catch-up. So the clock is now their biggest enemy. Because if this solution comes too late, the championship could already be out of reach. But if it comes early enough, if they introduce it in the next races, then what we saw in China stops being a setback and becomes the turning point. The exact moment where everything started to shift. Because sometimes, you don't find the answer when everything works. You find it when everything breaks. And right now, Red Bull might be closer than anyone expects to unlocking the one thing that can bring Mercedes back to reality. And this is where the real threat to Mercedes begins. Not on track, not in the results, but in what's happening right now, behind closed doors. Because once a team like Red Bull understands the problem, they don't move slowly. They accelerate everything. Development cycles get shorter. Decisions get sharper. Risks get higher. Because they know exactly what they're chasing. And that's when things become dangerous. Because unlike other teams, Red Bull doesn't need to guess anymore. They're no longer experimenting. They're targeting. Every simulation, every test, every adjustment, now has a clear objective. Stability under load. Clean energy flow. Controlled deployment. The exact areas where Mercedes built their advantage. And here's the part most people underestimate. In Formula One, the biggest gains don't come from adding performance. They come from removing limitations. And that's exactly what Red Bull is trying to do. Remove the instability. Remove the hesitation. Remove the thermal spikes that force the driver to back off. Because the moment those limits disappear, performance doesn't increase gradually. It explodes. And that's the scenario Mercedes is trying to avoid. Because right now, they control the pace. They dictate the races. They operate in a window nobody else can reach. But that advantage is fragile. Because it only exists as long as others don't understand it. The moment Red Bull fully decodes that system, the advantage doesn't shrink. It collapses. And that's why the next races are so critical. Not just for points, but for timing. Because if Red Bull introduces this solution soon, even a small step forward, it could completely change the dynamic on track. Suddenly, Verstappen isn't defending. He's attacking. Suddenly, Mercedes isn't managing races. They're under pressure. And pressure changes everything. Strategy becomes riskier. Mistakes become more likely. Drivers are forced out of their comfort zone. And that's where dominance starts to crack. But if Red Bull delays, if they need more time, if the solution isn't ready, then Mercedes keeps building momentum. race after race, extending the gap, making the championship harder to reach. And that's the balance right now. A race within the race. Development versus execution. Understanding versus timing. And everything depends on which side moves first. Because one thing is already clear. China wasn't just a failure. It was a revelation. The moment Red Bull stopped guessing and started understanding. And in Formula One, understanding is the most dangerous weapon of all. Because once you have it, everything else becomes possible. So now the entire season hangs on one question. Not whether Red Bull can catch Mercedes, but when. Because if that moment comes sooner than expected, then what looks like dominance today could turn into a completely different story. One where the hunter becomes the biggest threat on the grid, and the team that looked unbeatable finally has something to fear. And this is where the story reaches its most important point. Because everything we've seen so far, the dominance of Mercedes, the struggles of Red Bull, the failure in China, it all leads to one final question. What happens when Red Bull finally gets it right? Because if their solution works, even partially, the entire balance of Formula One changes instantly. Not gradually. Not over months. Immediately. Because Mercedes' biggest strength right now isn't just performance. It's control. They dictate when to push, when to defend, when to manage. They decide the rhythm of the race. But the moment another team can match that control, that power disappears. Because then it's no longer a controlled race. It's a fight. And Mercedes hasn't had to fight yet. Not really. Australia was clean. China was comfortable. Even when Ferrari got close, there was always a margin. Always a response. But Red Bull is different. Because when they're competitive, they don't just follow. They disrupt. Aggressive strategy. Unpredictable decisions. Maximum pressure on every lap. And that forces mistakes. Even from the best teams. Even from the most prepared ones. So if Red Bull unlocks this, Mercedes won't just lose an advantage. They'll lose control of the race itself. And that's when everything becomes unstable. Because now drivers have to push harder. Engineers have to react faster. Strategies become riskier. And small errors turn into big consequences. That's how dominance ends. Not with one big moment, but with pressure. Relentless pressure. And there's another layer to this. One that goes beyond performance. Because right now, Mercedes is confident. Calm. In control of the situation. But the moment Red Bull starts closing that gap, that confidence changes. Doubt appears. Questions start inside the team. Are we still ahead? Is the advantage real or disappearing? And that mental shift is just as important as any upgrade. Because Formula One isn't just technical.